It's now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Daniela Lamas. Dr. Lamas is a pulmonary and critical care physician at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and faculty at Harvard Medical School. In her recent book, You Can Stop Humming Now, Dr. Lamas examines the thin border between life and death through real stories of patients whose lives were saved by modern medical technology. She worked as a medical reporter at the Miami Herald and is frequently published in the New York Times. She writes about modern issues in medicine with her unique real-life stories and a great deal of compassion for patients. Not only do we learn about the needed improvements in medicine, but also learn to understand doctors as not only a tool to recovery, but as compassionate professionals. She has written on humanism in medicine, medical ethics, and women in healthcare. Daniela has done research in many aspects of medicine, from current challenges of ineffective EHRs to chronic critical illnesses and death. Her work has been published in many journals, and following graduation from Harvard, quite importantly, she earned her MD here at Columbia, VPNS, where she also completed internship and residency. I also want to say that during this pandemic, Daniela was a voice of compassion, a voice of humanity, a voice of care, and a voice of healing, and quite frankly, a voice of inspiration for so many of us, me included. And I'm sure we're really in for a gift and a treat today. And I also encourage everyone to go back and look at some of the recorded pieces that are throughout the pandemic from Dr. Lamas to remind us of what we've been through, but also how fortunate we are for her presence in our craft. So Daniela, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. And we should really just stop here, but we'll continue. And thank you, Nika. That was wonderful. And I wish that maybe at some point I could work with you on awards somewhere. So, you know, it's a privilege to be here and to have the chance to honor Dr. Miller's legacy. And as a graduate, as you heard, of Columbia PNS and of the internal medicine residency program here, I've heard Dr. Miller's name often in these halls, and his legacy has really felt so strongly that though I never met him, I actually had to remind myself whether I had met him, because his face, the picture, sort of feeling of somebody who is always in movement with this smile, that's something that I've seen before and that's grown to feel familiar just simply by being here. And so this is a particularly meaningful invitation for me. So to set some expectations, there will be slides essentially to give you something to look at other than me, but this isn't a slide-based talk. And so instead, I just want to talk with you about my path in medicine and really sort of my own struggles at various points to find ways to cultivate empathy, which for me became intertwined with writing. And because we're going to be talking about narrative, I'm going to share stories. And I hope to leave, I think we actually have budgeted, so I have no choice but to leave and would like to leave some time for discussion with all of you. So, you know, when I walk into this building and look across the street at the hospital and think about sort of who the patients and the stories that have influenced my own path as a doctor, I always return first to one in particular, sort of the title story from the book that was mentioned. And so I'm going to tell you the story. So it's winter in New York City. It's just here. It's winter in New York City. And it's a decent number of years ago. And I'm an intern in one of my first rotations in the hospital. And I'm in the cardiac intensive care unit here at Columbia, where I'm taking care of a man about my age. And he is dying. He was a lawyer, as I remember it. I think he had like a pretty good job. He was sort of a rising star type of character when he was diagnosed with a rare cardiac condition causing heart failure. And he had been transferred overnight, one night, to our hospital from some sort of outlying hospital to wait for a transplant. And as the team in the cardiac intensive care unit, we were to take care of him. So I remember this morning gathering outside his room and on rounds and watching him. And as my co-intern presented the events of overnight, I learned that his heart had stopped a few times the night before. In my mind, that meant he had died a few times the night before being shocked back by his internal defibrillator. But there he was that morning, awake and alive and on his laptop, struggling to get into the hospital wireless to surf the internet. Now, this patient terrified me. Odd that I just accidentally said pandemic. This patient terrified me. I wasn't used to seeing anyone this sick, nearly my age. And I knew that if he didn't get a heart, he would die, and it would be terrifying, and there would be nothing that I could do to help him. As a result, I wanted to stay as far away from his room as possible. And I did. I was able to accomplish that for a time, but then inevitably I was the intern in charge of procedures, and he had a fever and he had a central line, which meant that the central line could be the source of the fever. So somebody had to pull it, and that somebody was me. I entered his room. It was the first time I had been in there without my team. And there he was on his computer again. Hey, I said. I explained why I was there, that I had to remove the central line in his neck. But first I would cut out the stitches and then I'd pull it. And when I did, I told him I wanted him to hum. He looked up from his computer then and gave me a perplexed expression. Hum? He asked. I realized it was the first time I had heard him speak. He sounded like a regular guy. I explained to him that I didn't want an air bubble going in when I pulled out the line and killing him before his disease would. Okay, he shrugged. Sounded reasonable. We had asked so much of him. This must have seemed small by contrast. I braced one hand against his shoulder. All right, I said, now start humming. I pulled out the line, jammed the gauze down, but not before a drop of blood sort of spilled down, and I watched it spread out on his gown. He turned his head toward my hand and flinched. Sorry, I said. We were quiet. Outside, it was snowing. It was winter, and it's going to be a white Christmas. I held pressure. We waited. He was on blood thinners, so my resident had told me it would be a while, and I was taking that very seriously. It's like Siberia, I said, out there, foolishly, to fill the silence. You know, he replied, I was there once, Siberia. Turns out he had taken the Trans-Siberian Railroad with his friends, gone places I had never seen. It's awesome, I said. It was, he answered. We waited. Hey, he said, are you on Facebook? I'll friend you and you can see my pictures. Oh, I said, yeah, I guess I am. So that night I logged onto Facebook and I found his friend request. Without pausing much on the meaning of it all, I clicked accept. And there he was, but not with swollen belly and cheeks, bruised arms and legs. This boy on Facebook, I mean, he was cute. He liked Radiohead, it said, and Tom Clancy. He had been sending these status updates from the ICU. You would never know he was so sick, but to me, they were missives from a dying man. The next day and the day after, I rounded on him, but with the team. I didn't go into his room. The fevers came back. Wasn't the central line after all. Soon after that, I rotated out of the ICU and on to the general cardiology ward service. And I didn't often think of our exchange, but occasionally at night when I couldn't sleep, I found myself logging onto Facebook and clicking on his page, looking at the photos and reading the updates. And then one day I got a message. Can I stop humming now? So I wish I could tell you that I responded, but instead I logged off. At that point, I wasn't sure why. Didn't visit his page again, afraid somehow that he could sense my online footprints. Months passed, and then one evening, apropos of not sure what, I found myself navigating to his page. When I clicked on his name, the photos I knew had been replaced by messages of condolence. They stretched for pages and pages, and I read each one. Then, knowing what I would find, I opened the online medical record. Turns out he had made it out of the ICU briefly, but then got another infection of some sort, and then his kidneys failed, and then there was talk of a VAD. But when it became clear that he was never going to get a transplant, that he was never going to be okay, his family had finally said enough. He was gone, but his message was there in my inbox, sort of hopeful and waiting. And now I knew that I would never get to respond to it. So I didn't tell anybody about this story when it was happening. But months, I don't know, even maybe a year after, I told a story to a friend who was not in medicine. And I told the story in this casual way that I had learned to sort of get about talking about what it was to be a doctor, and like the same detached tone that I used to explain the strange fact that when we declare death, we have to shine a light in the pupils and then gauze in someone's eyes. So it was sort of in that tone that I told this story. But even though I took on that kind of vibe, it was clear to me that sharing that story was important to me. There was something cathartic about that process of telling, of being heard and seen, and so much so that just telling it to this one person wasn't enough. I wanted to write it. So I had worked relatively briefly, but it was something that I loved as a reporter before med school. And writing had been a source of great joy for me. And I had always thought that I would find some way to merge writing and medicine. But the truth was I hadn't made that a reality at all. In fact, I'd stopped writing pretty much when I got to med school, overwhelmed by the mandates of memorization, the demands of anatomy lab. We had a very traditional curriculum at that point. I'm envious that you are not experiencing that. And, you know, I think it was as though I felt that I had closed the page on that chapter of my life and that I had made this decision that was permanent to sort of make this break. And though, of course, I knew there were doctors who were writers, many of them in this city and in this building itself, I couldn't really see how those paths would intersect for me. And I knew of narrative medicine. I sort of had read about the theories, but I felt myself drawn to kind of understanding and analyzing my patients' stories of illness, but it all felt so far from my everyday. I mean, I needed to draw blood cultures and my patient had no accessible veins. Could any of that help me get an IV in his foot? I found myself as a med student and then intern year beginning to kind of harden into the sort of person who would, distill their patients into boxes on a scut list. There was no real choice but to do that. But that Facebook story was something different. And as cliche as it might sound, and it does a bit, but it is, cliches have a purpose. That was perhaps the first time that year that I had paused and truly recognized the humanity of this person in front of me. So anyway, this would be the first writing I had done about medicine. It was a different type of writing than anything that required sort of journalistic objectivity. It was a story about a young doctor and a way for me to understand what I felt was a real and perhaps the first real meaningful mistake that I had made. But it was also just about two people fumbling for connection. And when it ran in a paper some months later, I was thrilled. And then I got a call from an administrator here. We needed to meet. So of course I panicked. Nobody's like happy to meet with an administrator. Anybody in knowing my audience, some people are thrilled to meet with administrators, but in this context, it felt very different. It didn't feel like a happy thing. So what had I done wrong? I mean, what hadn't I done wrong, really? Like, had I talked to my patient's parents about this story? Nope. Should I? I mean, I probably should have. I hadn't. Should I have even written it? Many of the online comments on the piece, I'll show you a few, had really berated me as a doctor. And one even said, I didn't include this one. One said that if I chose to stay in medicine, which they knew there was a lot of sunk costs with the loans and stuff like this, I should definitely go into pathology. So was this administrator also sort of angry at my admission of where I had gone wrong and perhaps suggesting a transfer of a residency to pathology? So, I was surprised then to learn the real reason that I'd been called into this office. So first of all, I was told I never should have replied. I never should have accepted the Facebook friend request. And this was, it was like so long ago, but Facebook was like a little newer. So they said, we didn't have a policy about this. You can't get in trouble explicitly for it, but we need a policy. And so we're going to make a committee. And so will you be on the committee? Like, sure, I'll be on the committee. Never heard back. Still happy to be on the committee. But the bigger issue, I'm told, was that I had admitted to searching my patient's record when I was no longer taking care of him. And not for educational purposes. It wasn't that I had written, I'm so curious about the history of heart failure and fevers, but for curiosity. And that was wrong, plain and simple, that I was curious about what had happened in almost a social way, and I had searched the record for that purpose. When my care for him ended, I was told, so too should my access to his record. And I had crossed a line, that those were boundaries. And, one way to look at that, and I agreed, it felt like he was correct. And at that moment, I decided, I think both consciously and on a less conscious level, that I would have stricter boundaries, that I could feel for my patients fine, but that I needed to do this in a way that was much less messy and tangled and more removed, that was appropriate. I had kind of grasped a connection here using writing to explore this kind of shared personhood, using sort of acting out my curiosity about who was this person who was my patient by looking at photos on Facebook, but that was wrong. And I wouldn't be in this position again. And so that patient and that administrative interaction afterwards stayed with me and prompted questions that to some extent I'm still answering today. And these are sort of, how do we cultivate empathy while still keeping necessary boundaries intact? What are these boundaries that we need to have? And when we think about how to be compassionate clinicians, how to connect with our patients, narrative serves a real purpose, but there's also danger. It's so tempting to assume that writing about patients is inherently this act of compassion and connection, but it's really complicated. So, there's some questions that I want to pose that I'll talk a little bit about here, but also we'll talk about in the session later, which is, should we write about our patients? I mean, what is should, but if we are to do that, what are the lines and how do we define them? Why do we write about our patients? And what is my goal when I take this private moment and turn it into a story where I am the protagonist? And how do we think about that in terms of humanism and compassion in the care that we deliver? So with these questions in my mind, I actually didn't write again for some years after this essay. I don't think it was the feedback per se, though it did leave me feeling nervous. But as I moved from internal medicine residency to pulmonary critical care fellowship now in Boston, the intense work to become a critical care doctor left me with time for little else. And yet, as my colleagues began to explore academic research, and I along with them, this was something I was supposed to do after all, I felt acutely the fact that there was something that I had loved that was no longer a part of my life. And at the same time, I was really struggling with the realities of intensive care medicine. Back in residency, I had loved codes. I mean, I raced to the code, pager falling off, the whole thing. But, I love the intensity of the ICU. It's why I chose it. But here in fellowship, the sadness of all of it, it really sort of started to strike me and became suffocating. I remember early on in fellowship, the winters, I guess, I hate the winter, but winter of this first year of fellowship in the middle of a family meeting, one of so many family meetings with a family that just didn't get it, and leaving the room and actually kicking the wall. I mean, taking my foot and slamming the wall and then looking behind me like who had seen me. And nobody had, but I had seen myself, and I found myself terrified that if I got so frustrated, maybe this wasn't for me. Maybe I should leave fellowship. I didn't really apply the terms burnout or compassion fatigue then. Maybe I didn't know enough to apply them to myself. But what I knew was that I was dragging myself from family meeting after family meeting in a windowless conference room. And I was talking to people in the hardest, most awful moments of their lives, and they were suffering, and I could see it, but I didn't really feel it, and I owed them something better. So it was around that time that I ended up getting in touch with this editor that I had known some years back, who invited me to start freelancing some pieces. And I didn't know if that would work out or how, but I knew that what I was doing, that the way that I was going about for practicing, learning to be an intensive care unit doctor, working in the hospital, trying to do research, that wasn't working for me. That didn't allow me to be the best version of that self. And, navigating these painful moments of life and death and impossible decisions that occasionally I felt as though I was drowning in it. And somehow this idea of reporting, of telling stories that took me outside myself became, for lack of a better term, a life raft. And so that's what I did. During the time that I was supposed to be doing academic research, I started to pitch ideas. And these ideas, I thought I wanted to get as far away from the ICU and critical care as I could, but it turned out that the ideas that I were pitching were things I saw in the hospital. They were the stories that frustrated me. They were the times that I felt impotent. And somehow, when I looked at these issues about communication between patients and families, and some more that I'll tell you about, when I looked at them as stories to tell, I was able to move beyond frustration into curiosity. So, I had found myself in many of these meetings with patients who had survived these catastrophic interventions in the ICU. I found myself so frustrated by the stories I saw in the public eye that largely perpetuated the idea that there was this sort of life or death dichotomy, that survival is success and death is failure, and these are the only two outcomes of our intensive interventions. And I knew that I wanted to find some way to complicate that understanding and those definitions. But I didn't really know how, not in the setting of those meetings for sure. But I think that meant for me that I had to understand for myself what actually happened to my patients after they left our doors so that I could explain it better to families. And so I went out to find people who were living in this after, who had survived critical illness, but had perhaps not recovered. The patients whose outcomes we don't talk about. These are not the patients that we see sort of on the news. And so I spent time first in long-term acute care hospitals, which were places that I did not find myself drawn to, but I definitely not to practice as a doctor, although ultimately I do spend some time practicing in an LTAC now, which is something. But I spent time in these hospitals with the most visibly devastated of the sequelae of critical illness, and I was able to meet with these patients, those who could talk, and I was able to talk to their families. And in doing so, I was really able to begin to learn what their expectations had been in the intensive care unit, in these conversations that they had had with doctors like me, and what they had heard, and how those expectations did or didn't align with their ultimate realities. I then went on to talk with this amazing woman, and these are sort of, a lot of these became the stories in this book. I went on to talk with this amazing woman named Nancy Andrews, who's an artist, who's had an aortic dissection. And she was lucky. She was actually in a clinic when it happened. She was airlifted to the Brigham. She was an amazing save. Everybody had told me that I should talk to this woman. She was such an amazing save. And what she told me was, yes, she was an amazing save, but her life had been forever changed by the post-traumatic stress that came to her as a result of her intensive care unit time. She had been extraordinarily delirious in the hospital. And when she returned home, when she closed her eyes, she would return to these awful, delirious hallucinations. And she wondered what was wrong with her. She went back to her doctor. They said, but you're an amazing save. And this was sort of before ICU post-traumatic stress syndrome and sort of post-intensive care syndrome more broadly were understood. But her life was really shaken by this. And ultimately, she was able to find her way back through her own art, through these sketches, which are very striking. But what she told me was that she really needed sort of doctors at that time who heard her story and who wondered, well, what is this? Who didn't just see her as, an amazing save. And so I met other broken survivors. There's a term that one of them used, of intensive care. I spent time at their homes. I got to know this young man who had survived an opiate overdose. He had nearly died, but now he was home and he would never be the same. And I got to talk to his mother to learn what those decisions had been like in the acute care setting. And here, without the pressures of time and stress in the hospital and the patient-doctor barriers that are inherent in this relationship we have, I could allow myself to open myself up to their stories. I had to be curious. I was there to write about them. And then I think with curiosity came empathy, that key characteristic of people who are really great doctors that I knew I was in danger of losing. Because there in their houses, patients were able to tell me about the goals that were important to them. And not just tell me, but show me. And I was able to hear them and see them in a way that I couldn't in those windowless family meeting rooms. It might sound oversimplified, but slowly, sort of piece after piece, as patients told me about their interactions with the healthcare system, the good and the bad, they told me about their lives before and took me into their lives after. I could begin to see my role in it all again and feel compassion for my patients and their families, but also hearing these stories of their recollections of what the doctors told them, really compassion for myself too. I mean, this was all so hard. So those pieces that I wrote during my fellowship, I think were one of the reasons, and they were, a lot of these were reported pieces that either were like not really published somewhere or published somewhere small, but they were so important to me. I mean, I really think that like that experience of going into these homes and having this reason to and reframing that relationship, sort of the reason that I stayed in fellowship and stayed a doctor. And they changed the course of my path as a doctor too. So after spending time with Nancy Andrews of the sketches here, learning about post-intensive care syndrome, I not only changed the way that I interacted with patients in the ICU, knowing that they might remember these things that I used to think that they never would, but I also began a clinic for survivors of intensive care. And the template of that is what's currently become our COVID recovery center. Telling these stories, entering these worlds didn't just allow me to take the step back that I needed, but mandated it. And in taking that step back, I was able to better see the longitudinal arc of care and the patient experience and think of ways to make it better. So though I had grasped onto the idea of reporting out of some kind of desperation, it became more. And it really became an essential component of my career as a doctor. And I think continues to show me, and as I think about it, I think the way I can frame it is continues to show me a way to bring curiosity within some boundaries to the care that I deliver. But these boundaries have always been sort of confusing to me. And I think they are confusing. And I found that I was hungry to explore stories like that Facebook story that were much more personal, that really spoke to me about who I was as a doctor, sort of where I did good and where I faltered. And so I wanted to tell the stories, not just as a reported way, not just to hear someone else's recollection, but I wanted to tell my stories of hard conversations, of the nuance, of everything that had tortured me so much early on. And I knew that in telling those stories, I could understand them better. But still there was that question that had started years earlier here in that C-suite office, which is how do you go about writing about patients without breaking their trust, without turning curiosity into something that's self-serving, exploitative even, so it's somehow wrong. And I think a lot of that, that I struggled with had to do with like, what is true? And do you tell a story as fiction or nonfiction? And so just a brief story, let me tell you, a couple of years ago, I have a patient who's 78, he has emphysema. He used to fly planes before his breathing problems started, but now he can barely walk up the stairs. He's been in the hospital for a couple of days on antibiotics, round-the-clock breathing treatments, but only getting worse. One morning, I come into his room to find him sitting on the side of his bed, breathing quickly, hands clutching the sheets, neck veins bulging. Now pause. So what if I told you he wasn't actually 78? Would you still trust me? And then if I admitted that he was never an aging pilot at all, but I'm actually remembering a woman who wrote poetry, and as far as I knew, had never flown a plane, I wouldn't blame you for feeling misled. So back to the scene, I move in quickly. I see the patient, neck veins bulging. I listen to his chest. I hear breath sounds on one side, not on the other. And I know that this man has had a lung collapse. He's developing air in his chest. We need to do a needle decompression. But the truth is that even though I should know how to do it, I've only done it in a sim lab and I'm scared and I don't think I'm going to do it, even though it's the right thing. So I asked the nurse to please call the code team. I'm sitting there. I have a couple seconds. I can wait, begging them to come before I have to do this myself. So now pause again. So this part's mostly true, but the patient that I'm really thinking of was actually sedated to the point of unconsciousness in an ICU. But the point of the story, the moment of fear, when I knew what I might have to do, but didn't know if I could do it, that part is entirely real. So is this a true story? Does this count as a nonfiction story about writing about my patients? I've invented a character in order to protect my patient's identity, and in that way, it's a work of fiction. But the intention here is to relay the reality of experience, something that's about my fear and my hesitation. And in that respect, the story is an entirely real piece of nonfiction, isn't it? So these are the questions that I started to ask myself as I returned to writing stories about my patients. How to tell a story that's at once true and respectful of my patient's privacy, particularly in a climate that we're in now where medical truth where misinformation and distrust are so rampant. How can we obscure actual details and still call something a work of nonfiction? And if we are doing sort of frankly nonfiction, sort of as I did in this Facebook story, how can we do that without exploiting our patient's trust? And I'm not alone in these questions, though there are more and more doctors writing stories, sort of memoirs, tell-alls. We're creating this genre without an entirely clear roadmap for how to navigate the terrain. And of course, we can avoid including HIPAA, identifying information. I don't need to put a name, age, or social security number, but these essays often include things that are even more private, where I want them to include these things. The moment of a diagnosis, the response to terrible news, to a death. You know, the question that my hospital media relations always asks me is, would the patient or the family be able to reasonably recognize themselves? They suggest things for me, say adult child instead of daughter. Delete a piece of remembered dialogue that seems overly specific, which sometimes I do, but sometimes when they're asking me to obfuscate a key piece of story, I don't. And this standard makes sense in a way, but it easily lends itself to either flimsy dialogue or crossing a line into fiction entirely. And that doesn't necessarily answer the true question here, which I think is, even if what we write is not recognizable in some sort of court of law, is it ethically acceptable? And beyond the low bar of acceptable, is it an action of connection and understanding or exploitation to write an essay about a deeply personal moment in a patient's life without their okay? So maybe I should always ask for the okay, but that process too is imperfect. You know, when we meet someone in our role as a doctor, that person is vulnerable. And as I'm an ICU doctor, often actually just unable to talk, so I have to talk to a family. And even if they wanted nothing to do with my writing, I'm not sure that most of my patients or family members would feel entirely comfortable saying no. I mean, if one of your doctors wanted to write about you, how would you react? So I want to tell you about one instance some years ago. Actually, not that long ago, but anyway, a year ago, I was interested in writing, I don't know, time's funny. I was interested in writing about the experience of patients. This is something that I'm still sort of playing around with because I think it's fascinating. Patients who are awake on lung bypass, ECMO. It's a wild thing, right? So it's both barbaric and futuristic at once. Their patients are awake doing physical therapy in the intensive care unit, leaving their rooms while their blood is siphoned out of their body into this huge machine next to the bed, or medium-sized machine that does the work of the lungs. And this is a fascinating machine, first sort of using peds and then in the OR, but it also brings up all sorts of ethical quandaries. We talk about ECMO, when we talk to patients about it, as a bridge, not a destination. These are terms that we use. And what this means is that the purpose of this machine is to buy time, either for lung recovery, which is where we used it a lot in COVID, or for transplant, lung transplant or heart as well, depending on sort of the etiology of the sickness. But what this means is that if neither of those options come, this machine that is keeping this person alive will stop. So we set those terms at the outset. The patient knows this as much as anybody can know such an unimaginable thing. And so what I wanted to know is what it was like to be on this machine waiting, knowing that this was the only thing that was keeping you alive, and that unlike dialysis for the kidneys or a heart assist device for the heart, you couldn't leave the ICU with it. And thus, because we make this sequence of assumptions that this is true, you couldn't stay on it forever. So I started, and really what that was a question that I was curious about. I was curious about it as a doctor, but also just as a person. Like, we have created this experience that is entirely unimaginable. Nobody in the public really understands what that is. Who can understand that? You know, can I tell that story? What would it be to tell that story? So I started to spend some time with this young woman who was waiting for a transplant on ECMO. And a couple of my colleagues had recommended that I spend time with her. She was bored, they assumed. She had been on ECMO for the longest of almost anybody in our hospital waiting for lungs. And so I'd taken care of her very briefly one weekend, but we didn't really know each other. And so I went up to her room in the thoracic ICU, and she and her mom every night would watch Spanish telenovelas and eat ice cream from a local ice cream place near the hospital while she just waited on ECMO, waiting and waiting. And I started to spend time with her. And I mentioned in our first conversation that I might be interested in writing. Whether she registered that, I'm not sure. But she was okay with an extra person sitting in her room watching Spanish soaps. And so I stayed there for weeks, and I learned about her. I got a little to the point where I was asking her about like what she would think and about what might be ahead and how she felt about the fact that this could go terribly. But really, we just kind of like watched TV. And as time passed and I felt like I got to know her, I felt comfortable asking her if I could write about her. I had mentioned at the outset that I might, but now I wanted to. Was she okay with it? So she seemed surprised. And then she was asked me, who would be curious about this story? Who would want to know it? And I explained to her that I felt like her experience behind these curtains and closed doors, this was an experience that should be shared. I wanted to understand it. I wanted other people to understand it. She kind of looked at her mother and considered. And then she said, no, she didn't really want me to write about her, if that was okay, she said. And so then sitting there with those tubes coming out of her neck and her tracheostomy tube and her hospital gown, her mom at the bedside, she actually apologized to me. I'm so sorry that you spent this time here to write about me, and I don't want you to. And then I found myself in this horrible move asking like, well, can I just not use your name? And she said, no, she didn't want to be written about in any way. And I will tell you, I felt awful, as if I had taken advantage of my role as a doctor and inadvertently caused her harm. I was the one who should apologize to her. Suddenly, I had admitted that my motivation in coming to spend time with her was impure. I was at once observing her both as a doctor, but also as a writer. And in asking her if I could write about her and telling her why I was there, I had revealed that underlying motivation and this problematic assumption that just because I came in scrubs and a hospital fleece, and because she was vulnerable, she would say, okay, it was as though I'd been hanging out in her house and under sort of false pretenses. So I think that power differential, which she ultimately was able to take back that power, and I'm glad that she felt able to do that, but there was some real moral ambiguity there. And I think that's some reason that some doctors suggest that we leave the realm of nonfiction medical narratives altogether and move squarely into fiction. So Dr. Writer Anna Reisman, who some of you likely know, tells junior doctors who take this narrative medicine elective that they should actually possibly do fiction instead, that the solution might be to leave nonfiction essays behind. She tells them to construct characters with complex lives who may or may not be based on their own patients, toss them into charged situations and see what happens. There's values in real stories, she says, if doctors are careful and responsible. There are ways to write essays about patients, but sometimes the truth can emerge more clearly and more kindly through the prism of fiction. And I think kindness is an interesting perspective through which to see these questions. Was it kind of me to spend time with that patient, to learn about her life, and then to admit that I was doing so in order to write about her? I'm not sure. We had connected. My drive to write had encouraged, had sort of allowed these moments of connection. But then when seen through the lens of this mission, the connection felt false. But was it? Sitting there at her bedside, I had learned about her life. These moments had deepened my understanding of what it was to be in your 30s, trapped on machine, not knowing if a transplant will come or not, and knowing that if it doesn't, you'll never leave the hospital alive. But I'm not sure that's the way she saw it. So maybe it's true that the compassionate action is to use what we have learned to tell fictional stories. And so I did start to enter the world of fiction, but then the pandemic happened. And when the doors of our hospital closed to visitors and to reporters, it quickly became clear to me that the stories from inside the hospital, told not as fiction, but nonfiction, they mattered. And if we didn't tell them, who would? And yes, I worried about betraying confidence. I tell a story that revolves around something said to me on a phone call. Is that too close? Maybe. Is there something self-aggrandizing about writing about any of this at all? Maybe, but there's also a greater purpose. And as the pandemic wore on, increasingly it became clear that people needed to know what was going on in hospitals in a way that wasn't politicized, and that patients weren't going to be able to tell these stories. They were too sick. Their families weren't going to be able to tell the stories. They weren't there. And for me, being able to share what went on, process it through writing was essential. When we told the visitors that they had to leave in that first week and we weren't sure when they would return, I wrote about that moment. When we started to care for patients post-vaccination who weren't vaccinated and struggled with sort of how we maintain empathy while caring for those patients, a question that I still don't think we have an answer to, wrote about that too. And maybe I just needed release, but I also felt like there was a greater good in telling these stories and bringing people these moments from our world. We could immortalize our patients in these stories, and maybe we could change minds. Because whether they're told through fiction or nonfiction, stories are an agent for change. I mean, we all struggle currently, right? With how do we change people's minds? How do we change the minds of people who don't think like us? And I don't think it's data. I mean, we need data, but that's never what changes minds. It's stories, the simple act of telling and sharing stories, which inspires empathy through curiosity and shifts minds in a way that evidence simply doesn't. And I think it's important to note that we don't always have to be perfect or empathic in these stories. We can be frustrated and misstep, but we just have to remain curious. And for me, writing has allowed me that. And, we deal with such deeply tragic, complicated work on a daily basis, not just in the intensive care unit, but in the ER, in the clinic. Our jobs are hard and there's real trauma to bearing witness to suffering day in and day out. It has a cost. And writing about that doesn't solve it, but it gives it voice. And the structure of having to write and the fact that published writing means you're never alone with your own thoughts is, for me, the best antidote I can imagine to burnout and the way to continue to remain compassionate in the face of sort of an onslaught of incoming emotion. And how that happens, I think, is about curiosity and connection. And stories are what connect us. My patients tell me stories about their illness. Then I turn that experience into narrative, a process that asks me to reach outside myself, put myself in their shoes and see the world through their eyes, even if briefly. And if done well, then that brings readers in. And isn't that sort of what we do as doctors? We hear our patients' stories, we tell them and retell them, and we find meaning in them. One layer of that process is scientific and diagnostic, but another layer of it is simply human. So I remember years back, I first learned about the idea of narrative medicine here at Columbia in med school. And as I remember, it was at orientation, and we went with a group of other medical students to one of the great museums in New York City to see how artists had portrayed suffering. And, because it was med school orientation, we had had some party the night before, and we were all bleary and didn't feel too great. And I knew that there was something I wanted to understand, something beautiful that felt important that they were trying to teach me, but I couldn't really figure out how to hold on to it. Everything we were talking about felt so far apart from my reality. I couldn't understand how it mattered, how it would help me to memorize and ultimately fill the little boxes on that SCUT list. But now, years later, I think that we're all sort of closer to getting it. All of it, all of this writing about patient experience and figuring out how to do it in a way that doesn't break trust, that's essential to me to being a doctor. It's my own way to process and to be less alone at times that otherwise feel deeply lonely. We tell stories to communicate, stories about illness, about what we fear. And through these, we're able to enter another person's mind, even for a moment, to leave the isolation of our own experience. And that process helps remind me of what it is to be a doctor and the amazing privilege that we're all granted of being able to witness these moments in another person's life. And it's okay if it doesn't always feel like a privilege, if you're angry and frustrated and burnt out. There's so much asked of us. But I think if we find a way to stay curious, we'll be okay. I wonder now if I could go back in time, respond to that Facebook message, whether I would actually reply. And I'd like to think that I would. It would be a brief reply. It's good to hear from you, I'd say. You can stop humming now. With that, love to take some discussion and questions.